Well, I would like to invite David Spielman on the floor, please. Thank you. David Spielman, thank you very much. A few words on David Spielman. He leads the research agenda at IFPRI. IFPRI is the International Food Policy Research Institute. He's a senior research fellow there. He covers a range of topics under the umbrella of agriculture science, technology, and innovation policy. His work includes research on economic policy issues relating to agriculture, innovation systems, input markets, seed systems, research and extension, and private research and development investment. He maintains a regional emphasis, mainly on East Africa and South Africa, but also regularly branches out into more global perspectives. So I would like to welcome Mr. David Spielman. He will present a keynote on expanding the evidence base on the impact of rural advisory services. Please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let's first make sure that works. Oh, that works. That's great. Well, thank you very much to the organizers of GFRAS for asking me to speak on this keynote panel. Let me just jump right into it. You know, over the years, extension and advisory services have been criticized for many failings. I think we're all aware of that. Professor Ruth Howe gave us a nice list of these failures back in 1999. It's not my intention to repeat these criticisms or draw your attention to them. I think you're all well aware of the causes and consequences. What I do want to discuss is the role for evaluation in, first, measuring impact, second, improving implementation, and third, influencing policy change in support of extension advisory services. So why is evaluation important? Everybody, I think, knows this. This is nothing new. It helps us learn. It helps us build evidence about what works and why. It serves the purpose of accountability, helping make governments and organizations more accountable to the objectives they set out to accomplish. It contributes to transparency, and it helps create a more open relationship between funders, implementers, and beneficiaries. It allows for feedback or lessons learned iteratively to improve interventions in the field. And of course, it informs policy design, which is the focus of this GFRAS meeting, allowing us to design policies that are based on what works rather than what is expedient to those in power. So as a starting point, let's remind ourselves why we actually evaluate extension systems and rural advisory services. Our main aim is to somehow measure the impact of extension on technology adoption. After all, one of the main jobs of advisory services is to affect productivity increases, welfare improvements, and resource conservation through technological change. Through new cultivars, soil fertility enhancements, pest and disease control, and the management of crops, soil, water, trees, and forests. So in the last several decades, we've expanded our knowledge well beyond the biophysical constraints to adoption, right? The sort of lack of soil, fertility, the lack of water. We've learned about the individual and household constraints to adoption and the relationship between adoption on the one hand and access to credit, land tenure arrangements, age, education, social capital stock, and so on the other hand. More recently, we've moved into the study of how underlying human behaviors and preferences affect adoption. So now we're investigating complex determinants of adoption, such as ambiguity preferences, present bias in time preferences, loss aversion, and aspirations. So my argument is this, and I'll go through this throughout the presentation. To truly understand what works in extension, we really need to evaluate alternative approaches to the very first step before adoption. And we do need to do this with much greater rigor than we've done so in the past. So our colleagues who evaluate health and education programs in developing countries already do a lot of this work. They evaluate performance-based incentives like teacher that on behavioral outcomes like student learning and test scores or patients' compliance with a treatment. And yet, in agriculture, we still haven't gotten on board. We're still a few steps behind. We jump to the issue of adoption and yield or income gains or soil fertility really before we understand how adult farmers learn. So I'll come back to this point shortly. The next point I want to make is this issue of better designs and more rigor. Let's talk about why we need better designs and more rigor, greater rigor in evaluating extension. Let me first point out that impact evaluations of extension programs are plagued by at least three problems. One is sample selection bias. Those who learn about or adopt a technology may have fundamentally different characteristics than those who do not. They may have self-selected into an extension activity, or they may have been targeted by the extension agent herself. They may be contact or model or progressive farmers by design. They may be similar, those farmers who adopt may be similar to other farmers in observable characteristics like age, wealth, landholding size, and education, but they may be dissimilar in some unobservable characteristic, like willingness to learn or preference for ambiguity or loss. But if you compare adopters against non-adopters, it's like comparing apples and oranges. Self-selected farmers are systematically different than other farmers in their population. So any inferences you make about which farmers or the ease with which farmers learn or benefit from a technology may be biased. Biased inferences can result in poor policy outcomes. For instance, national level replication of a successful pilot program in extension might underperform if expectations are based on biased evaluation results and poor methods. The other problem is attribution or attributing outcomes like adoption or increases in yields or incomes to extension. So many factors confound that straight line of causality between extension and adoption. Reverse causality, for instance. We all know what that is, right? So for instance, does extension improve adoption of a technology among farmers? Or do farmers participate in extension activities because really they've already adopted the technology and they just want to build their social networks? Simultaneity. Do farmers adopt because their peers adopt? Are there peer effects at play? Or simply because extension agents influence the decision-making process? Or put another way, do farmers adopt simply because they have similar characteristics on average or at the mean, and thus tend to have similar behavior? Or are they responding to these or issue is heterogeneity? Consider the problem that our impact evaluations tend to report the average effect of a treatment, that is extension, on adoption or other outcomes, right? I mean, everything that we report basically is an average. Certainly that's what us economists tend to do. But within any given population of individuals, there are groups that differ from each other and respond differently to an extension intervention. So it's important but difficult to measure these heterogeneous effects. And that's something that we have to do better in our evaluations. So that gives you an idea of what our thinking is in the sciences about better designs and more rigor. The point of this is that the state of the art has advanced in recent years. We have a better toolkit than ever before to address sample selection bias, causality, heterogeneity, and heterogeneity. A lot of us have turned to experimental methods such as randomized controlled trials, and these have become very popular in the development literature, especially with respect to health and education, but again, not so much in agriculture. In the last 5, maybe 10 years, we have seen studies of extension, information and communications technologies, and technological change in agriculture using these methods. And that's a very good sign. Non-experimental methods are a second best option, and we certainly are using them quite extensively, especially when timing, logistics, or ethics prohibit the use of randomized controlled trials. Both can be used to measure effectiveness and, importantly, cost effectiveness, which actually seems very absent in many evaluations of extension at present. The simple question of what did it cost to achieve this outcome per farmer is something that we need to be able to answer with much more certainty in our evaluations. Of course, there are limits to all of these tools. RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, are often criticized for their artificial, non-realistic designs, while non-experimental methods still face issues of addressing biases and heterogeneity. The choice of quantitative approach that I'm describing ultimately depends on circumstances. But good evaluators, the evaluators that you turn to evaluate your programs, should have all of these tools in their toolkit, in their back pocket. Furthermore, a rigorous quantitative approach like I just described, combined with qualitative diagnostics and descriptive analysis, is almost always preferable. So getting back to my main point, with a better toolkit, we can apply state-of-the-art tools to evaluate how different extension approaches affect learning outcomes. Only then should we be able to make inferences about adoption, productivity, and welfare. And there's some great work emerging in the literature that gives us the conceptual grounding for this. There are lots of studies out there, at least in a qualitative dimension, that evaluate different outcomes by type and intensity training of farmers. There are studies that evaluate the step-by-step process of learning, from awareness to experimentation to adoption, under different extension approaches, comparing, for instance, a sort of chalk and talk training and visit approach with a farmer field school approach, with a demo trial, with a mother-baby trial, with a farmer research group, who knows what. There are studies that evaluate changes in aspirations or the goals that people set for themselves under different states of exposure to new ideas and images. There are studies that evaluate learning failures or that lack of noticing that can be influenced by the extension approach. And there are studies, of course, that evaluate peer effects or the impact of learning externalities and the nature, size, and boundaries of the social network between farmers. But to tell you the truth, a lot of the extension evaluations that I read still seem a little bit unfocused to me. Too many studies are simultaneously assessing multiple extension approaches and/or multiple technologies, right? The result is you've got this attribution problem. Are your outcomes, whether it's yield or income or nutrition or whatever it is you're measuring, are your outcomes the result of the extension approach, the farmer field school or the training and visit module, or are the outcomes a product of the technology itself, whether it's some integrated soil fertility management package or some new cultivar and inorganic fertilizer package or who knows what. Too many things moving at once to really attribute change. So my suggestion, and people are already doing this, don't get me wrong, my suggestion is for a single technology or a single crop management practice or what have you, compare and evaluate which extension approaches better facilitate learning, behavioral change, and then adoption. And the key here is to compare different approaches. Try a standard T&D approach, or try a standard chalk and talk approach with farmers, and compare that to your farmer field school approach, or compare that to something even more participatory and advanced. Then evaluate which extension approaches generate higher rates of adoption, productivity, welfare, environmental outcomes, whatever it is you want to measure. And importantly, in the process, also measure the cost effectiveness of each extension approach. It's not easy to do this. I struggle with this in my own work, day in and day out, because it means convincing extension agents, agronomists, and project leaders to open the doors to evaluation of their extension approaches, not just their technologies. Many agronomists I work with really don't want their technologies questioned in the real world. I can understand that. They spend 10, 15 years of field testing and demo trials under scientific conditions to show that their technology works. And now along comes the evaluator and says, well, under real conditions, it's useless. Nobody wants to hear that. No one's going to open the door for you if that's the possibility. But working more closely together with agronomists and understanding the limitations that they face, the limitations you face, I think you can get to more effective solutions. This is something, like I said, I struggle with, we all do, and hopefully we can build bridges in the future. So ultimately, there's that final question that is the focus of this GFRAS meeting. The question of, so what? How can better evidence affect a change in policies and investments made ultimately by governments? Because they are the biggest provider of extension. It's not an easy question. There are many roads to the centers of power. Indirectly, for instance, by influencing the quality of discourse and discussion among researchers and analysts like ourselves, who often design extension programs for the government. Indirectly through practitioners, advocates, and other stakeholders who use evaluations to make their case for greater investment in extension or specific extension approaches. Or indirectly through farmers and farmer organizations who are often their own best advocates of change. I think it's poignant to talk about this here in Argentina, where some of the most impressive changes in extension and crop management in soybean, wheat, and maize cultivation have occurred precisely because farmers and farm organizations used evidence to be their own advocates and forced the government to make changes in partnership. So ultimately the point is this. We've got this complex diagram here that you're not supposed to memorize of how we influence policy. As an evaluator, I can provide one bit of information into this complex diagram that I hope will have the ability to influence policy change based on evidence. It's this. There may be a higher probability of success in affecting policy change if the message carrier, yourself, myself, can demonstrate that extension approach A can increase the benefits of technology X by Y% when compared to other extension approach B at the cost of dollars Z per farmer. That's what a good evaluator should give you. You should be able to walk away with that, influence policy with that message, and you shouldn't settle for less. Thank you very much.